But then I'm stuck because it's hard to come up with a concise statement of what exactly that is. So often I fall back on statements, common practices like, oh, well, we preserve intellectual capital and we preserve institutional knowledge, which is just as illuminating, right? Well, what is intellectual capital? As a piece of language, it's a metaphor. You remember your high school English lessons in simile and metaphor? A simile is a comparison using like or as, such as your eyes are like the green sea after a storm. Okay? A metaphor combines things more directly, and usually with more power to create a larger experience. For example, your sea green eyes storm into mine and sweep me away.
You've used these before, right?
And they work. Intellectual capital as metaphor. So what is it, the phrase intellectual capital combining? The term capital, wealth or assets available for the use and production of further assets, and intellectual, what is known. So intellectual capital, what is the wealth of what you know, which may be used to produce further wealth. Pretty clear. So knowledge management helps preserve the wealth of what you know to produce further wealth. Institutional knowledge as metaphor. This one's a little harder. Institutional, of or relating to an organization or establishment founded for a specific purpose. Familiarity, awareness, or understanding gained through experience or study. I've tried combining these in a nice, concise statement, and I have a hard time doing it. It's hard to come up with something neat that makes sense, that makes more sense than that. So I found that it's easier to compare this to another term. Okay, institutional knowledge, and okay, compare that to individual knowledge. Well, that's just knowing something, right? An individual who knows something. On an individual level, knowing is created through memory, experience, and the neurochemistry of the brain. If an institution can know something, therefore, the mechanisms for doing so would be between its records, its data networks, and the individuals who use them, okay? So if you draw that parallel out, though, if you saw, imagine how you'd regard an individual whose thinking or behavior exhibits the same qualities as an institution, wherein functional units might operate without communicating with each other. Ever see that happen? Or, they don't talk to each other, so such a person operating that way might not be capable of coherent speech or coordinated movement, or be apt to shout out things that don't make any sense. We would regard such a person as crazy. And yet, it's no strange phenomenon to see institutions behave this way, as we see in cartoons like Dilbert or shows like The Office, who expect institutions to be crazy. And so institutional knowledge might more often be experienced as institutional insanity. That's a concept that's not hard to understand at all. So this brings me to the case I'm going to talk about at VDOT. The situational context at VDOT really was crazy. Was the Springfield interchange, where
we call it the mixing bowl.
The mixing bowl. So how many people here from DC? You've driven that? You know what craziness is, right? Okay. Okay, for VDOT as an institution, this was an amazing project. And remember, it's just one among thousands of projects that VDOT administers every year. This one was built in 7 phases over 8 years, costing $676 million, came in on time and under budget, and boasts 50 new ramps and bridges within a 2-square-mile radius. This is an extraordinary engineering accomplishment. Think about what that involved.
Who was the contractor?
There were multiple contractors, many.
Did they collaborate?
No. It was finished in July of 07. 7 months later, in February of 08, a freak ice storm hit the area at peak rush hour, froze the entire area, stranded thousands of motorists, causing hundreds of accidents over a period of hours. Okay? Crazy, really crazy. But it was something that VDOT had never dealt with because nothing had ever happened on that level of complexity before, at this kind of, because this is one of the most complicated interchanges in the world. VDOT actually had equipment staged and ready to go to deal with ice, but because of the gridlock, could not get to the facility. Okay, if you don't think this was making some people crazy, then yeah.
Secretary of Transportation was stuck.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Now I don't feel so bad.
The external and the internal context. The external context was that the federal government had recently mandated that all critical agencies would institute National Incident Management System and Incident Command System structures to implement emergency response procedures, but they didn't give any guidance on how to do this in a transportation context. Also, VDOT has decades of experience dealing with accidents, clearing snow and ice, and all that kind of thing, but had never before regarded emergency response, per se, as a core business. All right? Additionally, within VDOT, there are two distinct elements which have very closely aligned but very different missions: maintenance and operations. Maintenance, as you can imagine, would be responsible for maintaining the road, fixing potholes, guardrails, that kind of thing. Huge budget. Operations, which is responsible for maintaining the system and the flow of traffic. Okay? Although we really don't have any authority to do anything like the DMV or the police, we're just trying to do as much as we can to make sure traffic is flowing as well as possible. So that's operations. In addition, VDOT has a largely oral culture. Experiences and practice are passed on through long situated apprenticeships. And by long, I mean decades long. 40 years of experience in one position is not uncommon at all. Okay? Finally, it has a practice versus a process culture. People at VDOT do not like to talk about what they do or how they do it, and especially not to write it down. They want you to come along and see how they do it and learn from them and then do it that way. Okay? Because writing it down is a waste of time and it gets in the way of my work.
You're right.
That's not VDOT.
That's not just VDOT? No. Where else is that?
Everywhere.
So there's a phrase that you might use: a practice versus a process culture. Okay? So the key implication is that individuals knew how to respond to emergencies, but the institution had no idea how to be an ER agency. And that phrase brings us back to metaphor, because we're saying that an institution had no idea how to do something. You're accepting the idea that an institution can have ideas. Okay? So why is it that metaphors are so deeply involved in our thinking? Okay, as Aristotle observed, remember, it is metaphor that is in the highest degree instructive. Metaphors are very, very efficient at helping us make all kinds of connections between concepts, situations, emotions, all this stuff very, very quickly in ways that we would otherwise find very difficult. You heard metaphors in the previous two speeches. The one about everybody's idea was like their baby, it was like their child, and they didn't want to give it up. You got it right away. That was a metaphor. Okay? For example, now research shows that metaphors don't just describe the world, they actually shape the way we perceive and interact with the world. Okay? And I can provide you with all kinds of citations. One study talked about German and Spanish speakers. In German, keys are feminine. No, keys are masculine. In Spanish, they're feminine. German speakers will tend to describe keys as hard, heavy, jagged, metal, serrated. Spanish speakers will describe keys as tiny, golden, lovely, little. Okay? The word bridge is feminine in German, but masculine in Spanish. So German speakers will describe bridges as fragile, elegant, peaceful, pretty, and slender. You can see that. But Spanish speakers will say big, dangerous, long, strong, sturdy, and towering. Okay? Now, we don't have gender for nouns in English, but we do have similar linguistic habits. For example, which one of these would you use to describe a successful marriage? Which set of words? A or B? If it's, okay, so, successful marriage.
B.
B. Anybody say A? No? That's okay, there's an outline of information. All right, which one would you use to describe a successful business relationship?
A.
Okay? So can you imagine somebody saying, wow, they have a really efficient, strong, effective marriage? As opposed to a vibrant, healthy, happy marriage. Now, you would think that either relationship could be described by either set, but people do tend to choose one or the other. And you notice that set B are all health images. We tend to use health images to describe relationships of a very personal nature. Business relationships are less personal, so we use A. We tend to use A. Okay? Of course, it's not perfect, but you see the point. So, therefore, knowing the particular metaphorical expression used to describe any given process of feeling or idea has a profound influence on how that idea is seen and understood. You with me? Okay. So one of the most useful things you can do to develop your ability to think is to develop your ability to work with metaphors. The problem is, language can be very hard to examine. Okay? Especially when it's so transparent and so closely associated with the idea that you cannot separate the two. You confuse the map with the territory. For example, what is this?
Characters.
How's that true?
Anybody read Chinese here? So to you, this is very opaque. There's no transparency here. Actually, if you know what it means, it's actually exactly the same as this. What is that? More precisely, it is a picture of a cat. But nobody says that. You just say, that's a cat. If you're a Chinese speaker, you would say, oh, that's a Mao, which means cat. All right? So it's also called katze, Mao, goyami, and cat. And when you consider the array of language, the array of terms that we use to describe this particular animal, you can see that it's totally arbitrary. But it's still very difficult to separate. For example, look at this and think, petting it and going, oh, nice kitty. Yeah. Of course, in another culture, that might be lunch. All right. So, when you're unable to separate the word from the idea or the map from the territory, managing what you know becomes almost impossible. All right? Because language is this intricate web of symbols and symbol systems. It's almost like a metaphorical sea of our own making. We don't even realize we're swimming in it. So the metaphorical context at BDOT was that we had these new concepts and new methods and a new need to produce an ER response agency without any idea of how to do it. And more deeply than that, the two major populations, maintenance and operations, saw similar terms, we were using similar terms, but we're seeing different things without knowing they were doing it. Okay? For example, one of the key roles in emergency response at BDOT was the duty officer, or the DO. The maintenance people would see the DO as someone who knew how to push snow. The operations people would see the DO as somebody who knew how to operate systems. Okay? Same term, different animals. Right? But they had no idea that they were seeing really different animals. And so they got together and just tried to come up with what they were going to be doing all together. I'm sorry, I'm going to run over a little bit. Okay. The first attempt to institutionalize came up with a week-long institute where they were trying to get whole upper management together for 4 days, 14-hour sessions, to learn every aspect of every top possible emergency. Snow removal, incident management, hazmat response, all that stuff.